London, spring of 1815. The air shimmered with perfume and promise, and every carriage that clattered along Grosvenor Square carried the weight of ambition and gossip. Inside the Whitmore townhouse, the season's grandest ball had just begun, and Lady Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of the Viscount of Ardenton, stood at the edge of the ballroom floor like a vision pulled from poetry. Her gown, of pale ivory silk and gauze, caught the candlelight as if it remembered sunlight. Her composure, quiet and sincere, was that rare form of beauty that never clamored for attention. Her smile was gentle but fleeting, a small act of rebellion in a world that measured worth by whispers. The orchestra began a waltz, and Captain Edmund Fairfax bowed before her, his scarred hand steady, his uniform gleaming. For all of London, it seemed a perfect union. The brave officer and the noble's daughter, duty-bound and divinely matched. Yet not every man in that glittering hall admired them. Standing by the refreshment table, Lord Charles Harrington, the son of an earl and an artful manipulator of men's fates, watched the pair with a smile that never touched his eyes. His fortune had waned, his political prospects dimmed, and the favor of certain powerful families now seemed beyond reach. To him, Eleanor was not a woman to be loved, but an instrument of leverage, a name to ruin, a rumor to shape. It began with small remarks, spoken with the lazy charm of a man too confident in his cruelty. "Curious," he murmured to a group of young lords, "that Lady Eleanor receives letters so frequently, and never from her fiancé." Laughter followed. By morning, a shadow had settled across her reputation, and by nightfall, the first of many invitations were withdrawn. Unaware of the storm gathering above her, Eleanor carried herself, as always, graceful, patient, untouched by pride. She wrote to Captain Fairfax, requesting a meeting, but his reply came curtly through his aide. He would not see her. The silence was more painful than the slander. At dinner that evening, her father's hand trembled as he set down his wineglass. "There are matters I cannot defend, Eleanor," he said, his voice tight with humiliation. "The Fairfax family has withdrawn the engagement." Her mother's gaze turned to the tablecloth, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly, as though all the chandeliers in London had gone dim at once. The next morning, she ventured into Hyde Park, where the gossip of society was as thick as the mist. A pair of ladies, veiled and perfumed, paused as she passed. "Such a pity," one whispered, "so young to be disgraced." Eleanor walked on, her steps even, her chin unbowed. Yet each word clung to her like dust that no washing could remove. When she returned home, a letter awaited her. It bore Lord Harrington's seal. With trembling fingers she opened it, hoping, naively, that it might contain an apology. Instead, it was a triumph written in ink. "My dear Lady Eleanor, society is cruel, but truth crueler still. I pray you find comfort in solitude." Beneath his signature, a mocking flourish. She tore it once, twice, and cast the fragments into the fire, watching them curl into silence. Days later, the gossip reached its crescendo. Lord Harrington had insinuated that she had met him privately, an unthinkable impropriety. False letters, written in her name, had been discovered. There was talk of a servant who had seen them together. London believed what it wished to believe, and what it wished was ruin. Her father, unable to bear the public shame, made arrangements for her departure to their country estate in Shropshire. "Time will pass," he told her, though neither believed it. On the morning she was to leave, the household staff avoided her eyes. Her mother kissed her cheek once, without speaking. The carriage stood ready, its wheels half submerged in rainwater. Eleanor stepped inside, clutching a single trunk, letters, books, and the last fragment of her youth. As the horses lurched forward, she gazed through the window at the city that had once adored her. Behind her, the chimneys of London dissolved into mist. Ahead lay exile. In that dim, swaying space between departure and oblivion, she felt the weight of everything unspoken. Her innocence, her pride, her father's disappointment, the laughter of people she once called friends. She whispered to herself, "Let them speak," as if words could form a shield. But the echo that came back was hollow. The countryside rolled past in shades of green and sorrow. By dusk, they reached a small inn where the coachman stopped to rest the horses. Eleanor stepped outside to breathe the damp air. A gentleman, tall and dark-haired, was dismounting from a black mare nearby. His coat bore a faint insignia of the Duke of Ravenshire's household. He glanced toward her briefly, his expression unreadable, then looked away. She did not know him, yet there was something about his bearing, a quiet authority, a stillness that did not belong to the idol. The innkeeper addressed him with deference, and Eleanor heard the name, His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshire. The man inclined his head in greeting, then disappeared inside without another glance. It was a moment of no consequence, yet lingered in her mind. The Duke of Ravenshire was a figure of legend in London circles, a soldier, a widower, a man rumored to have turned his back on society. He had fought at Waterloo and returned with both scars and secrets. Now, seeing him briefly under the low lantern light, Eleanor felt the strange awareness of a presence both solemn and unshakable. He seemed untouched by the vanities that had destroyed her. She wondered, fleetingly, if all men of honor had vanished from England, or if a few had simply gone silent. By the time her carriage reached Shropshire, night had fallen. The Whitmore estate stood silent, its once grand gardens overgrown. She entered her chamber, where the fire had been lit by some dutiful servant, and removed her gloves slowly, as though shedding a former life. The mirror offered a reflection both familiar and foreign. The same eyes, but no longer soft. The same mouth, but stripped of its easy laughter. She sat beside the window, listening to the wind clawing at the shutters, and realized that this quiet disgrace might be her only companion for years to come. Somewhere far away, in a London drawing room still echoing with gossip, Lord Harrington smiled at his own cleverness, unaware that the seeds of his undoing had already been sown. For among the silent watchers of that season had stood a man who despised deceit more than ruin itself. The Duke of Ravenshire, though absent from society's favor, remembered every injustice that bore the scent of cowardice. And as Lady Eleanor closed her eyes that night, unaware of his memory, the wind carried through the hall the faintest murmur of what was yet to come, a promise that disgrace was not the end, but merely the beginning of a reckoning. 7 years passed like a long winter that refused to thaw. The world had changed since that night when Lady Eleanor Whitmore left London behind, yet her name remained a quiet wound in drawing rooms that thrived on memory. In the quiet countryside of Shropshire, however, scandal had softened into rumor, and rumor into mere curiosity. The villagers called her the lady of the old estate, the one who never attended church dances nor spoke of her past. Her days were simple, teaching letters to farmers' daughters, tending the gardens her mother once adored, and walking each evening by the riverbank where willows bowed like penitents. Her solitude had become less of a sentence and more of a discipline. On a brisk spring morning of 1822, a new figure rode into the county. The Duke of Ravenshire, Sebastian Hawthorne, returning from years abroad. He was a man whose name carried both reverence and unease. Having served as an officer during the Napoleonic campaigns, he was said to have turned his estate into a sanctuary for soldiers, widows, and orphans. His countenance bore the gravity of one who had seen too much and spoken too little. To the village, his arrival meant new employment and the restoration of old lands. To Eleanor, though she did not yet know it, it meant the reawakening of a life she had long buried. The first time she saw him again was at a gathering hosted by the parish vicar, a modest garden fete meant to raise funds for a new schoolhouse. Eleanor had prepared a small table of books and writing slates for the children. She wore a gown of soft gray muslin, simple but immaculate, her hair pinned without ornament. When the Duke entered the garden, conversation ceased for a moment, as if the air itself paused in recognition of rank. His presence was quiet, almost somber, yet his eyes, dark and perceptive, missed nothing. He greeted the vicar, then turned noticing the solitary figure by the bookstand. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Her composure faltered only slightly before she lowered her gaze in courtesy. "Lady Eleanor Whitmore," he said, his voice low, deliberate, and strangely gentle. "It has been some years since London has had the honor." "I fear London has forgotten me entirely, Your Grace," she replied, her tone measured but carrying the faint edge of sorrow. "Then London remains unworthy of your memory," he said, before moving on to greet others. The exchange was brief, yet its echo lingered through the afternoon. In the days that followed, the Duke made discreet inquiries about her circumstances. What he discovered disturbed him more deeply than he expected. She lived on a modest allowance from her father's estate, refusing assistance, maintaining her independence through teaching and small acts of charity. Her servants were few, her household plain. There was no bitterness in her reputation, only quiet endurance. But the truth behind her fall, once dismissed as scandal, began to unravel before his eyes. From a steward, he learned that Lord Harrington, now a respected member of Parliament, had risen to prominence during the very months that Eleanor was cast out. Certain letters that elevated his influence had been traced to the same handwriting as those used to discredit her. The realization struck the Duke like a silent blow. He had once served beside Harrington in social circles, trusting him as a man of wit and charm. Now he saw what ambition had cost, the honor of a woman whose only fault was grace. Within a week, quiet gestures began to appear around Eleanor's small estate. The roof, long in need of repair, was mended overnight. A new pianoforte arrived for her pupils, its maker's name left unsigned. Books of poetry appeared on her doorstep, each inscribed only with a single letter, R. At first, she assumed some charitable committee had taken pity on her situation. But when a messenger arrived with an envelope bearing the seal of Ravenshire, her pulse faltered. Inside was a brief note written in an elegant, disciplined hand. "No charity, only acknowledgement. Every good thing you have given others deserves return. S.R." Days later, during a storm that turned the fields to silver, the Duke appeared at her gate under a black umbrella. She met him on the stone path, the rain curling against her face, her hands clasped tight within her shawl. "Your Grace," she began, her voice nearly lost in the wind, "if you mean to offer pity, I beg you refrain. I have endured enough kindness meant to disguise contempt." His expression did not change. "Pity, madam, is the indulgence of those who stand above. I do not." He took a slow step closer, rain beating on his coat. "What you endured would have destroyed most men I have known. Yet here you stand, still giving light to others." She wanted to turn away, to retreat behind the safety of her walls, but something in his voice, its steady warmth, held her still. "You speak as though you understand disgrace," she said softly. "I understand injustice," he replied, "and I have lived long enough to see that England preserves both with equal devotion." A quiet passed between them, deep and fragile. The rain softened, as though reluctant to intrude. She could not answer. Words felt too heavy. He inclined his head, as if accepting her silence, and turned toward his horse. "If ever you require aid," he said over his shoulder, "know that Ravenshire is not far." Then he was gone, the rhythm of hooves fading into mist. In the following weeks, Eleanor tried to banish the memory of that meeting, but it clung to her like a faint perfume, impossible to forget. The Duke's presence had unsettled something dormant within her, a small defiance against the quiet resignation that had defined her life. She resumed her lessons, her letters, her walks by the river, yet her thoughts drifted toward the figure who had looked at her not as a fallen woman, but as one wronged. Meanwhile, the Duke's resolve hardened. He summoned an old contact in London, a solicitor with access to Parliament's archives. Piece by piece, the truth of Harrington's deception unfolded. The forged correspondence, the bribed servant, the fabricated testimony, all woven into the tapestry of a single ambition. Ravenshire's sense of justice, long restrained by duty and loss, burned anew. Yet he knew that exposing Harrington too soon would risk further scandal to Eleanor's name. His plan would need patience, precision, and perhaps her trust. One evening, as dusk descended over the valley, Eleanor found an invitation sealed with the crest of Ravenshire. It bore only a line in his hand. For the children's schoolhouse, your counsel is desired. She hesitated, sensing the weight beneath the civility. To accept would be to reopen wounds long scabbed over. To refuse would be cowardice, something her soul had never tolerated. She pressed the seal to her heart, the wax still warm from his hand, and whispered to herself, "Then let us see if honor may truly be restored." Outside, the night deepened. The rain had ceased, but the earth still shone wet beneath the moonlight. From the far hill, the windows of Ravenshire Hall glowed faintly, like beacons across the valley. It was not love she felt, not yet, but the stirring of something rarer, the belief that her story was not over. Unseen, the Duke stood upon his balcony, watching the same moon, unaware that both their fates had already begun to entwine. The carriage that brought Lady Eleanor to Ravenshire Hall rolled through a long avenue of oaks, their bare branches etched against a pale winter sky. The estate stretched vast and disciplined before her, an embodiment of the man who ruled it. It was said that the Duke of Ravenshire ran his holdings as he had commanded his regiment, with fairness, restraint, and an iron sense of duty. As her carriage drew near the front steps, Eleanor's heart beat faster than she cared to admit. It was not fear. It was the quiet anxiety of a woman walking once more into society's gaze, even if only that of one man. The butler led her through corridors lined with ancestral portraits, each figure solemn, unyielding. The hall smelled faintly of beeswax and pine smoke. When she entered the library, she found the Duke already there, standing by a great fire. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable yet softened by something she could not name. "Lady Eleanor," he greeted, inclining his head. "I'm honored you accepted my invitation." She managed a composed smile. "I could hardly refuse, Your Grace. You said it was for the schoolhouse." "It is," he said, motioning toward a large table covered in papers and sketches. "But truthfully, I wish to speak with you beyond that." She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Then let us begin with the pretense of the schoolhouse before we abandon it entirely." He gave a quiet laugh, a sound so rare it startled her. "As you wish." For the next hour, they discussed plans for a new classroom, the needs of the local children, and how best to employ the estate's resources. Yet beneath their calm exchange ran a current of unspoken tension, drawing them closer with every word. Eleanor's poise never faltered, but she sensed his eyes studying her with a kind of reverence that unsettled her composure. When the final plan was set aside, silence filled the room, broken only by the fire's low crackle. "You once said," the Duke began quietly, "that you have endured enough kindness meant to disguise contempt. I hope you do not think my intentions share that disguise." She turned toward him, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. "I do not think your kindness is false, Your Grace," she said, her voice low, "but I do not understand it. You owe me nothing." "On the contrary," he said, "my silence years ago was complicity. When your name was destroyed in London, I did nothing. I heard the gossip, saw the ruin it caused, and I remained still. I had believed the lies." Her breath caught. "Why tell me this now?" "Because truth delayed is injustice prolonged," he said, "and because I cannot watch you suffer for a sin that was never yours." She looked at him, eyes shimmering though no tears fell. "You speak as though redemption is yours to give." He stepped closer, the firelight catching the line of his jaw. "Not redemption, only restoration." Her hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them before her. "And what would you restore, Duke of Ravenshire? My name? My family's pride? Those are ghosts, long gone." He studied her a long moment. "Then perhaps something greater. Your belief that honor and affection might still exist without shame." Eleanor turned away, her composure threatening to break. "You speak of dangerous things, Your Grace. Affection is a luxury for those who have never been scorned." "Then let it be a luxury I am willing to earn," he said softly. For a moment, She could not breathe. His words carried no courtly flattery, no expectation, only quiet conviction. Before she could answer, the door opened, and the steward entered with a message. The Duke took it, his expression shifting as he read. "Forgive me," he said gravely. "There is urgent news from London." She gathered her shawl, ready to leave. "I shall not intrude further." He interrupted gently. "No, you should hear this too. It concerns Lord Harrington." Her heart stilled. "Harrington?" He nodded. "It appears a motion in Parliament has been delayed due to questions of authenticity regarding his correspondence. Letters have resurfaced, letters once attributed to you." Her hand flew to her lips. "But those were destroyed. They were forged," he said, his tone darkening. "And now, it seems, someone wishes them examined." Eleanor felt a shiver pass through her. "If the truth emerges, it will not cleanse me. It will only reignite the scandal." "Not if it is guided properly," he said. "I have friends who can ensure the narrative turns toward justice, not spectacle. But I will need your trust." She met his eyes, steady now despite the storm inside her. "You ask for trust easily, Your Grace. Yet you admit you once believed the worst of me." He inclined his head. "And I have regretted it every day since. Let me make it right." The clock chimed softly. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "If I agree, it will not be for my sake," she said quietly. "It will be for truth's." "That is the only cause worth defending," he replied. That evening, as she rode back through the fields, the last of the daylight faded into indigo. She could still hear his voice, steady, resolute, echoing through her thoughts. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what it would mean to be believed again. Not forgiven, not pitied, believed. Meanwhile, the Duke stood alone before the fire, the message from London burning slowly in his hand. He had long believed that duty to his title meant restraint, silence, the appearance of moral distance. Yet as he watched the flame consume the paper, he realized that love, true, unwavering love, was itself a duty, one not bound by etiquette or fear of reputation, but by the simple necessity of justice. In the days that followed, plans unfolded quietly. Ravenshire's solicitor began collecting documents, while the Duke drafted a formal petition to the Lords to review the case. Rumors trickled through the capital, whispers that the Duke was intervening in an old scandal for reasons of honor. None yet dared to say the word love, though it hung unspoken between every line of gossip. Eleanor received another note, brief and unadorned. Asterisk, "The past is a shadow only if we refuse the light. Trust me. S.R." Asterisk, she pressed the paper to her chest, her breath trembling. Something within her, buried beneath years of shame, stirred awake. When she next looked out across the valley, Ravenshire Hall gleamed beneath the dawn. The mist curled over the land like pale silk. She knew the path ahead would not be kind, but she felt something she had not in 7 years: courage. The courage to stand beside the man who believed her worth was not defined by ruin, but by resilience. And somewhere within Ravenshire Hall, Sebastian Hawthorne, Duke and soldier, whispered to the empty air, "If it costs me my name to restore hers, then let history take mine." London in spring carried an air of false gentility, streets alive with carriages, gossip, and the scent of lilacs masking the rot of politics and pride. Lady Eleanor Whitmore arrived quietly, wrapped in a simple dove-gray gown, her carriage unmarked by heraldry. It had been 7 years since her name last passed through the doors of Parliament. 7 years since she had fled this city under whispers that clung like thorns. Yet now, beside her stood the Duke of Ravenshire, his expression composed, his presence commanding. Society had once bowed to his title, but today he had come not as England's most feared nobleman, but as her defender. Inside Westminster's great hall, the air shimmered with tension. The lords had gathered, murmuring in clusters. Among them sat Lord Harrington, still charming, still smiling, but his confidence brittle beneath the weight of exposure. The Duke's petition, supported by new evidence, threatened not only his reputation, but his very seat in Parliament. The forged letters, the same that had condemned Eleanor, had been traced back to Harrington's hand. Eleanor stood beside the Duke as he prepared to speak. Her heart beat steadily, not from fear, but from the gravity of what lay ahead. This was not merely her vindication. It was the reckoning of truth against vanity. The Duke glanced at her, his eyes offering silent assurance. Then he stepped forward. "Your lordships," his voice carried, deep and measured, "I stand before you not in pursuit of vengeance, but of justice delayed. 7 years ago, a lady of impeccable birth and character was cast from your society by deceit. Her letters, declared proof of impropriety, have been revealed to be forgeries, constructed for gain, for envy, and for the ruin of innocence. That lady stands here now, not as a supplicant, but as a victim of our negligence." The hall murmured. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others turned to see Eleanor, her poise unbroken, though her fingers tightened around her gloves. The Duke continued, his tone sharp as steel beneath velvet. "I, Sebastian Hawthorne, confess my silence. I believe the falsehoods. I failed her as a friend, as a gentleman, and as a guardian of truth. But today I will not fail her again." He placed a sealed folder on the table before the council. "Here are the correspondences between Lord Harrington and his secretary. Proof of forgery, of bribery, and of slander. I demand this House recognize its error and restore Lady Eleanor Whitmore's good name." Harrington rose, a flush spreading across his face. "This is absurd," he snapped. "These are the desperate theatrics of a man besotted." "Careful, my lord," the Duke interrupted softly, his voice a blade cloaked in courtesy. "You stand before peers who know the price of deceit. I suggest you measure your tone." Gasps rippled through the chamber. For a brief moment, silence followed, heavy and absolute. Harrington faltered, his gaze darting to the faces around him. His allies had begun to shift away. Eleanor's chest rose and fell slowly. The moment hung suspended, the weight of years pressing on her shoulders. She had dreamt of vindication, but now that it stood before her, it felt less like triumph and more like release. After a pause, the presiding lord spoke. "This matter will be reviewed, but the evidence presented is compelling. Lady Eleanor Whitmore's censure shall be suspended pending formal inquiry." It was not full exoneration, but it was enough. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, a tear escaping before she caught it with a steady hand. Outside the hall, rain began to fall, a thin, silver drizzle that turned the city's edges soft and blurred. The Duke offered his arm. "Come," he said. "You have faced them all. Now, let the world breathe again." They walked through the square in silence. The sound of carriage wheels and distant bells mingled with the steady rhythm of their steps. At last, Eleanor spoke. "You risked everything, your standing, your alliances. What?" He looked at her, rain glinting in his hair like shards of light. "Because honor without courage is hollow. Because I cannot bear a world where your name is spoken with pity instead of reverence." Her lips trembled, though she smiled faintly. "And if the lords had dismissed your plea, then I would have resigned my title and built you a home far from their hypocrisy," he said simply. "Somewhere your dignity could breathe." She turned her gaze toward him, astonished by the quiet sincerity in his words. The wind carried the scent of wet stone and lilacs. For a long moment, neither spoke. That evening, as dusk fell over Ravenshire House, the drawing-room glowed with the warmth of the fire. Eleanor stood before the mantel, her reflection caught between the flicker of flames and the darkened window. The Duke entered softly. "They have confirmed it," he said. "The letters were proven false. Lord Harrington's resignation is to be announced tomorrow." Her hand rose to her throat. "Then it is truly over." He stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the faint warmth of him. "No, Eleanor," he said quietly, "it is not over. It is merely rewritten." She met his gaze, her composure melting into something gentler, freer. "And what part do you write for yourself, your grace?" He smiled faintly, though his voice trembled with something raw and real. only that I am a man who loved a woman the world once scorned, and found in her the very grace I had lost." Eleanor's eyes softened. "You speak as though you mean to make a confession." "Not a confession," he said. "A promise." He took her hand, lifting it slowly, reverently. "You once said affection was a luxury for those unscorned. Let me prove it is instead the refuge of the wounded." Her breath caught, her heart stirring with something vast and unguarded. The firelight danced between them, painting their faces in gold and shadow. "You would face their whispers again for me," she whispered. "For you," he said, "I would silence them all." The room fell still. Outside, the rain deepened, drumming softly against the glass. Then Eleanor, for the first time in years, let her defenses fall. "Then let history judge us kindly," she murmured, her voice unsteady but sure. He drew her hand to his chest, where his heartbeat thrummed steady beneath her palm. "History," he said, "is written by the brave." She smiled then, a small, radiant thing, fragile as dawn. The Duke bowed his head, his lips brushing the back of her hand with reverence rather than claim. And so, in the heart of a world that once condemned her, Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood no longer a woman of disgrace, but of defiance, restored not by the mercy of men, but by the truth of her own resilience, and by the love of a man who saw her worth when society turned away. Outside, the bells of St. James tolled softly through the mist, marking the hour when ruin became redemption. The city's lights shimmered through the rain like distant stars, and within the quiet of Ravenshire House, two hearts, long burdened by silence, finally found their peace.